We are joined now by one of the most famous whistleblowers in recent times. In late 2021, Frances Haugen worked with the Wall Street Journal to disclose what have now become known as the Facebook files. Disillusioned with the lack of care Facebook had for countering disinformation on the platform, Frances revealed herself on a now iconic episode of the show 60 Minutes, disclosing that the in-house civic integrity team had been dissolved following the 2020 US election, despite the obvious need for this kind of moderation and oversight to continue. Frances is joined by Co and Sarah from peer-to-peer cryptocurrency organisation MobileCoin, who take a closer look at what she revealed and, crucially, the importance of ethical practices in this realm.
Hello, I'm Sara Drakely, the CTO at MobileCoin, and it is my pleasure today to speak with Frances Haugen, a longtime friend and the Facebook whistleblower. You've become an advocate for accountability and transparency in social media, and I am delighted to talk to you today about all things data, privacy, and building humane systems. And so the first... Go ahead.
Happy to be here. So glad to chat with you, Sarah.
Yes. All right. The first question I'm going to ask you is, what led up to your decision to disclose Facebook documents?
So I didn't come into Facebook with, a Pollyanna. It wasn't like I thought that, Facebook had never done anything wrong, or that I wasn't even super optimistic that I would be able to make that big a difference. But I knew that the issue of misinformation around like weaponization of our online social spaces was a really big deal. And so when I got an offer to work on civic misinformation, I jumped at the opportunity, partially because I had a very, very close friend who had helped me relearn to walk when I was ill a number of years before, get radicalized on the internet. And I worked at Facebook for about a year and a half until right after the 2020 elections. They dissolved the team that I'd come to Facebook to join. So I had joined Facebook because I saw that they had made a real substantial commitment to trying to be a better force in the world. They had built out a maybe 300-person team that was focused on Facebook's role in societies and topics like ethnic violence. Because at that point, there had already been, by the time I joined Facebook, there'd already been one mass casualty event in Myanmar where like hundreds of thousands of people died in an act of violence that had been facilitated through social media. By the time the election came around in 2020, the US election, there had been a second major casualty event, this time in Ethiopia. And right after the 2020 election, Facebook dissolved that team. And I'm a little rare in that I have worked on a large number of algorithmic systems across, Google search quality, Google Plus, Yelp, Pinterest. It's not like I only ever worked at Facebook, or I only ever worked in, little places, but I also have an MBA. And one of the classes I took in grad school was around change management. And change management sounds like one of those like dry phrases that a McKinsey consultant would put on a slide. It's like, this is the change management cycle or something. But there are like real pillars to what you need to do to change as an organization. So changing as an individual is so hard. Changing as a group is even harder because people have made all sorts of decisions over time that kind of lock them into a single path. And so if you want to change, you have to pick a vanguard and say, we, the leadership of the company, that is our future. These people are leading us there. And if you cross them, we're going to back up the vanguard. And Facebook did that for 4 years. And in the wake of the 2020 election, it seemed almost as if they had said, oh, great, there was no blood on the streets. We didn't have a revolution in the United States. Mission accomplished. And they dissolved the team. And that was the moment where I realized that Facebook could not heal from the inside, that they needed to have help from the larger community. That more people needed to be brought to the table if we were going to find democratic, responsible solutions for how to move forward. And so that was kind of like the trigger point where I started thinking about how could I bring the public in to help, and that was my inflection point.
Mm-hmm. And where we have a large cross in our Venn diagram of interests is in data privacy. And so
Mm-hmm.
I'm very curious what you've seen in your career, especially as a data scientist, to machine learning. What's been most surprising to you when you've looked at how different social media companies are managing data privacy?
So I think one of the things that's been super interesting for me around privacy is that I've been in the industry for long enough. So I'm in my late 30s. You know, I've been in tech since 2006. I have gotten to have a really interesting seat, just like seeing how have we as a community talked about privacy. So when I worked at Google, way back in the day, so this is like 2006, 2007, my first team I was on ads. And to give you a sense of like how we just didn't, like, people knew privacy was an issue, but people didn't really have the frameworks to think about privacy. Like, we were having conversations about, like, you know, what was appropriate in terms of, you know, they had just bought Urchin, which became Google Analytics. Now you have all this very sensitive data that might play a huge role in search quality or in ads. You know, are you allowed to use it? Like, the fact that we were having very basic conversations is just indicative of the fact that the tech community was not, you know, all of these institutions grow up in parallel, right? That we don't think about the level, like what the questions are around privacy until we accumulate enough data. We're like, oh, that actually looks concerning. I was at Pinterest when GDPR like was about to go into effect, and I found it so fascinating to watch how here's this law that's going to go into effect in Europe, and here in San Francisco, we are literally going through and tracking down like what data is being collected. Like, people just didn't know, right? Like, it wasn't a thing that people like, because most of these companies, they grow organically. They don't think about what their data management policy is from the beginning. You know, new social networks founded today do think about those questions. Products built today think about those questions. But back in, say, 2011, when Pinterest was founded, no one was thinking, oh, like, as we make these tables, we need to be able to track things. And so it's been really humbling to see how, you know, I think privacy is a great illustration of how society and tech can grow up together. That we can have relationships where we can say, hey, as the public, we have the right to understand what you're collecting on us. And when it comes to the larger functioning of social platforms, we don't have equivalent. We're only beginning to have those equivalent rights. Like, we only have had one law in the entire world, which is the Digital Services Act in Europe, passed, that even gives us kind of a level of parity in terms of having the public be able to ask questions for the first time of social platforms.
I love the observation that we're growing up together, and some of the contributions that, say, Google has made around differential privacy and open source libraries that other companies can now build on. Yeah, and these techniques that develop of can we ethically collect data and provide that data, provide analytics on that data without actually compromising the privacy of the people using our platform.
And I think one of the interesting questions there is, like, you know, if we were to talk to a critic of Google, like, almost certainly what they would say is, like, Google hasn't done enough, right? And I think that's actually a great illustration of, I think, one of the fundamental questions that we're wrestling with today, which is, you know, every time Google invests in privacy software, in some ways that's a cost center, right? Like, they don't directly derive additional revenue off of it, and maybe even they lose a little bit of revenue from doing those actions. We're asking, when we expect private companies to be the leaders in these technologies, you know, where does that line get drawn? Like, what is an appropriate level of investment? What's an appropriate speed of progress? And so, you know, Google, I feel like, has been a little bit more collaborative with the public in terms of saying, we hear you, we understand this means a lot to you, like, we're going to invest in it. But we don't see the same commitment across the board. Like, I'm pretty sure TikTok, for example, has not come out with the same relationship to saying, we're going to be transparent and we're going to work with you to figure out what an appropriate balance is.
That's an interesting comparison too, because I think and I'm sure you've seen this in your work, there are definitely different cultural expectations around data and how data will be managed, and different levels of trust that people have without even thinking about how their data may be treated. For example, having a regulation like GDPR that increases everyone in the EU's trust that their data is going to at least meet these guidelines. I'd be interested in how you think about trust and how regulations can either play into that, or how culture can play into that.
So I think that's a great illustration. Like, people often ask me, like, why? So there's a cliche that Europe is more willing to regulate or will move faster to regulate. I think it's also a thing of that they value some of these things more than the United States does. So in the case of the Digital Services Act, which is the law that I alluded to earlier, the law that says for the first time, hey, social platform, if you have risks, you can't hide them behind the curtain anymore. You have to disclose them to us, and you have to talk to us about how you're going to reduce those risks. And if we want to ask questions, you have to actually give us data as we ask questions. Right now, it would feel almost impossible to pass that law in the United States. And part of the reason for that is that we're actually using very, very different products, right? That Facebook made choices around censoring content that didn't scale with languages, right? Like Norwegian, they just left Norwegian out hanging in the bare because there were only 5 million Norwegian speakers. Similarly with privacy, so Europe was motivated to say, like, hey, no, we need to be able to put a little more input in because you haven't been valuing Lithuanian, Latvian, some of the smaller countries in the European Union, or even say French, right, German. When it comes to privacy, Europe has really lived with the consequences of what happens when we strip away privacy. That you can feel very secure that, like, oh, I have nothing to hide. But circumstances can change quite dramatically on time horizons that seem almost impossible. Like, if you had asked anyone in Germany in 1925, like, do you worry about your privacy? I'm guessing most people would not have said, I jealously guard my privacy. But today, like, Europe has lived with the consequence, a lot of what played out, not just in World War II, but also with, say, the Soviet bloc, where data was weaponized in really serious ways. So you can have, I worry that in the United States, because a lot of quite important Supreme Court decisions were made along privacy grounds, there are certain legal scholars now or certain political movements that say, like, we have no right to privacy. Like, all these things where we talk about people's right to, have our own spaces, like that's not a constitutional basis. I worry that part of that is that we don't understand how precious that is. Right, that is the thing that we do need to jealously guard, because the world can change quicker than you expect.
Absolutely, yeah, and it's a shame sometimes that has to be part of the education of a feature set. Is that this feature set actually protects you in a really important way that you may not feel today, but things may change. And so along these lines, we've kind of entered this new era of data privacy, and where data is, we think about it in terms of the photos I'm storing in this service, or the messages I'm sending to my friends. And I don't think we often think about our payments as data, but they're a huge data source. And
totally.
we really trust, this credit card that I'm using. I trust that this data is private when you're paying your therapist, or you're going gambling and you use your debit card at the ATM. And this data is actually far from.
Or it's even way more basic than that. Like, I think part of what made Venmo successful, right, was they rolled out into college communities. And they from the start acknowledged how social payments are, right? That money is a form of communication, right? And they allowed people to annotate that communication with things like emojis. And, like, think of how many people, like, there were minor scandals where, like, people were using various leaves, if you'll take my drift, in their text messages to imply certain things, or like a cigarette with a leaf, and like, people didn't appreciate that they were potentially not just outing themselves, but they were outing information about their friends, right?
Exactly.
And even those networks, those networks of interactions, like, part of why Venmo, I'm pretty sure why Venmo didn't charge fees, was they were mining all those interactions. That you can learn a huge amount about a person if you can just even see what their friends are paying for, right?
This is something I think you also have unique insight and kind of experience with, is how valuable is data? Do people understand how valuable that payment data actually is, and how much people are willing to pay, sometimes multiple times over, for that piece of data?
Yeah, I think it's one of these things where I've worked on 4 social networks at this point. Like when I was a kid, so both my parents are academics, and when I was a kid, I would like look at their work and I'd be like, how can you work on one question for like 30 years, right? Like that just sounds so boring. Like, how could you do that? And yet I keep finding myself looking at graph-based problems, right? Like, what can we learn through the connections between us, right? And, if you go look at the research on social media on how much data is leaked, not by you, but by the connections to your friends, they can tell who's gay, like just by looking at the data your friends believe, like the choices of your friends. They can tell your political affiliation, they can approximate your household income. There's all kinds of things where just understanding the graph of connections and how we interact with each other tells a huge amount about us. And I think one of the things that, like, so I support all the efforts you guys are doing at MobileCoin. Part of it is that even knowing that you and I bought a coffee at the same place at the same time, like that bleeds information about our relationships. And right now, I don't personally fear for my anything about my safety. But like when I was a whistleblower, I really didn't know what level of paranoia I needed to have. Right, that I was going to, like, I was working in a national security function effectively. Like I was working on the threat intelligence org within Facebook when I did my whistleblow. And I didn't know, what were my devices. Like I had been told beforehand, like I have enough friends that are security consultants, that I had been told by multiple people, you should assume your devices are compromised if you're working on misinformation at Facebook. Or I'm sure once I like actually joined the threat intelligence team, like my profile in terms of someone to watch like got a little bit higher. Because, I was like that front line of defense for information operations that might be aimed at the US. And it was really scary not knowing, like I actually started sitting there and thinking about like, if I were to catch me, like, how would I catch me? Like, what would you look for? And I think it's one of these things where your privacy is an asset that you should treasure because you never know when you're going to need to use it, right? I've had moments in my life where I gave up parts of my privacy because I thought, there was no reason why it would matter to me. But years down the line, for example, you're saying like paying for a visit with a therapist. I came in to be treated for seasonal affective disorder, which is like it gets dark and you get a little blue in the winter. And my therapist like warned me. She's like, "Do you want a depression diagnosis in your records?" And I was like, "Oh, it doesn't matter. Like, I don't have anything to fear. I'm not paranoid. I'm not paranoid." And years later, I got a clot in my leg, right? And I had an allergic reaction to a drug they gave me, and I literally started bleeding to death. It has like a 20% fatality rate. A bunch of other stuff went wrong. And I went to go file for disability, and I found out I had a very narrow time window that they would even support me because I had a depression diagnosis in my past, right? And so it's one of these things where like you think like, oh, I have nothing to hide, but it's not a question of like, do you have anything to hide? It's this question of you don't know how in the future this data will be used, and so minimizing your information footprint is really, really vital.
I'm so sorry that happened to you. And I think that's such an illustrative story. And the I have nothing to hide. I love, there's an essay by Moxie Marlinspike that we should all have something to hide. And the argument is that for social progress, you have to have privacy, because without, if we had perfect enforcement of the laws, and we would have to assume that all laws were just. And the reality is that progress happens and laws are not always just. And without the ability to break those laws in private, without the ability to form, for example, interracial relationships, without that being something that was possible when that was illegal, then we never would have known that that was wrong to be illegal and that it was right to make progress and to change those laws. But with perfect enforcement, no one would have ever been able to form a relationship.
But I think it's even more basic than that, which is like, you may think you have nothing to hide, but the question is like, are you believing, like, is someone else in your circle more vulnerable than you? And like, are you actually believing information about them through your actions? There's a lot of parallels in a way to like what I say to parents, which is that occasionally I'll speak with parents who are extremely confident that their kids are okay. They'll say, I invest a huge amount of effort in relating to my kids. I know what they're doing on social media. We have an open chain of communication. Like, I feel confident that if they started having a problem, they would talk to me about it. And I'll always say, like, I totally believe you. Like, I'm not skeptical of anything you're saying. But, when I was 14 years old, I had a person in my life had an eating disorder. She's a senior. I was a freshman, and she died of a heart attack. She had bulimia, and her heart stopped one day. And I thought I was fine, right? Like, if you had asked me a year after that, like, what did I think of this? I don't know what opinion I would have had. But like, I went to a conference, like a parents conference, and speaking there. And in the process of speaking to those parents, I realized that 20 years later, I was still upset about this. Like, I was upset about the experience I'd gone through. And so the thing I always say is, like, if you feel confident every one of your kids every one of the friends of your kids are okay, then you cannot worry. So when we talk about privacy, like, if you feel confident that you have no friends that might, the world changes 5 years from now, 10 years ago, like, you have a friend who's an immigrant today, you have a friend that has, is pushing for change. You have a friend that is a minority in some way. Like, if you feel confident that there's nothing that you're doing that might bleed information onto them, then sure, like, you don't have to worry about your privacy. But I think most people have people in their lives where, like, you like, being a little bit more cautious and saying, can I guard my privacy? Just because, like, there may be collateral damage. I think that's a larger thing we need to talk about.
That's incredibly powerful. And I think this is one thing when we're talking about graph-based data and graph-based systems, and payments is inherently a graph-based problem. I think what's very, what I find so responsible for educating people in the blockchain space around is that by nature, many blockchains are completely public. And so you have, there's pseudonymity, right? So there's this idea that, well, it's an address, it's not my name, but data is so, and you know a lot about this, data is correlatable in so many ways that the anonymity is really it's not there. It's not enough. If you're going to a coffee shop, your real-time location is public, because we have the address of the coffee shop, the public address on the blockchain, and then we also have the physical address of the coffee shop, and we can see in real time that you just did a transaction there. And as a industry, I don't think that we've thought through enough how we can, the promise of Bitcoin, the promise of Ethereum, of these cryptocurrencies is the idea of payments, but we can't actually have a payments infrastructure without privacy, is our hypothesis at MobileCoin. And I would love your thoughts on how do we build systems that have the features to keep people safe. And I think of these as humane systems where we're both keeping people safe, where it's built into the protocol to prevent exploitation, and users don't have to think about it. It's an implementation detail for them.
Well, I think one of the things that I find interesting about MobileCoin is that MobileCoin, one of the things I've become extremely aware of in the last, year is that people often have like certain go-tos for why they say we can't have privacy, right? So one recurrent one online is kids. They say, like, we can't have encrypted messaging, we can't have XYZ because, like, someone think of the children. And one of the things that I'm always trying to push on is that there's a lot of ways to design safety at the client level. You don't have to necessarily do safety at a centralized level. There's a lot of ways to design for safety on the client side. So this means things like, if you were going to say in there, what resources are we going to give kids? What kinds of patterns are we going to watch for on the client side? What do we want our app to facilitate or not facilitate? Because there's ways of designing these things in not such they are, telegraphing outwards that bad behavior is happening, but they're just, you can design the products not to work well in those minority use cases. And I think MobileCoin does a good job of kind of splitting the difference of saying, we don't need to track every cup of coffee you do, but we can say, okay, you just brought a huge amount of money off the platform. You need to account for that amount of money. And so being able to come in and say, like, there is a legitimate state need to impose some transparency requirements, but we don't need to know the minute details. And it's the same thing. Like we should be expecting that we're going to see end-to-end encrypted social platforms in the next 5 to 10 years. And we have to have conversations now around like what are the things we should say those platforms need to build in upfront, such that we can have safe private systems, because it's not an absolute dichotomy. It's like not like we can have privacy but no safety, or safety but no privacy.
Exactly. And I love your vision is for social media that we enjoy, that brings out the best in humanity. And I'm curious, when you're thinking about this dichotomy and how it's not black or white, what are some of the technologies that you've seen in your career that you think still need to exist that might help bring about that vision?
Well, I think part of it is this question around like, I always say in encrypted spaces, the things that keep us safe are each other and design. So like, we've had, confidential dinner parties for years. I can have a dinner party at my house. We can say all sorts of things. And no one worries that that's a national security risk. We can design software that's at a human scale, where humans are moderating things, where you can still connect with your family and friends without having a system that is easy to compromise by like state actors. The problem is that you can't have systems like TikTok, or you can't have, 500,000 person anonymous groups, because those systems do get compromised. And so it's this question of right now, we don't train people. Like you can't learn what the difference is at a fundamental level between the design of those products. TikTok is designed to be surveilled, right? They intentionally make it hyper viral. So they push as much of the eyeballs towards a very, very small number of videos every day. And they do that so they can manually screen every video, right? And there have been scandals in the last couple of years where if you're visibly gay or if you're visibly disabled, TikTok will take your content down to protect you. TikTok without censorship, the biases in the algorithm, the fact that the algorithm biases towards extreme content take over. And so it's this question of like, right now, we can't even have conversations about the design of these products, or questions around like what happens when we scale them, because there's no way to take even a single class today on these dynamics, like the physics of social networks. So one of the places that I want to contribute to in the next year is around a simulated social network, that it should be possible for any college student to take a class where they actually get to play with variations on these networks. Because little tiny design differences, like things as simple as like, should you have to click on a link before you reshare it, it dramatically decreases misinformation. And so when we move into an encrypted space, those design decisions are going to become essential. What do we do strategically on the client becomes essential. And we need to be training up a whole new generation of people who can think this way, because you're not going to get to develop that intuition internal to an encrypted social network, because you're never going to see the content.
Thank you so much, Frances. Is there anything you want to close with? Where do we go from here? Is there hope for a better tomorrow?
So one of the things that I find super exciting is we are starting to see entrepreneurs explore other ways of doing social media. So products like Be Real. So Be Real only lets you post once a day. It fires off a little notification on your phone. You get 2 minutes to like take a photo of your face and whatever's in front of you. Your content disappears after, I think it's either a day or a week. There's a lot of things that are built into the design of that product that make it very difficult to compromise for, say, an information operation, but it still lets people connect with each other. And it's one of the fastest growing apps in the world right now. I think the fact that we're starting to come in and say, what are the parts of social media that make us feel bad? What are the parts of social media that make us feel good? Focusing on our friends and family is a safety feature. Facebook has done experiments before where all they do is give priority to content that you asked for. So your friends, your family, pages you actually followed, groups you actually joined, and less priority to content you didn't ask for. Like someone invited you to a group and you got put in it for 30 days, even though you didn't accept the invite. Or your friend made a comment on something and now they insert into your feed. That has nothing to do with content. And yet when you do that, you get less violence, less hate speech, and less nudity. So we can have social media that's about our friends and family, and it's safe, but safe by design.
Thank you so much, Frances. It's been an absolute delight talking with you today.
Happy to chat. Have a great day.